Okay, so we stopped with Shays Rebellion. Um, Shays Rebellion served, well, it was a rebellion, but it's also an example of the tyranny of the minority, and that tyranny can come in forms other than from a dictator. The situation was that in Massachusetts, there was too little paper money, too much taxation. Some colonies actually tried to pay off the Revolutionary War debts and were very serious about that. Massachusetts was one. It had in 1780, Massachusetts had a very conservative state government. It levied high taxes to pay off the war debt, and these taxes fell hardest on the poor and the farmers, the way taxes normally do. And they were begging for relief. They wanted either the state to print more money, which would have made it easier for them to pay things off, or for the state to allow them to use their crops as payment, pay off the debts in produce. But the legislature adjourned with no relief measures made. So an angry mob led by Daniel Shays and about 1,200 people marched on the Springfield Arsenal with the goal of, one, arming themselves, two, taking over the government. What they wanted was a more flexible monetary policy, allowing the use of produce as money to pay taxes, or postponing taxes until the post-war depression was over. Don't race to pay the taxes, to pay the debt off. Let everybody kind of recover first. The state reacts with 4,400 militia, with artillery. They leave 4 farmers dead, but the farmers could still claim a win because the legislation eliminated some of the taxes on farmers. But the bigger issue with Shays Rebellion was how other people reacted to it. It really caused a very conservative and nationalist backlash. There was this realization that anybody can take up arms, and that we maybe need a stronger central government to help deal with it. This conservative and nationalism action or pushback started up calls for a revision to the Articles of Confederation. Even though that was on a state level, it still prompted, a national cry. And finally, in 1887, Congress endorsed a convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. 5 states had already started planning and had named delegates. By the time that the meeting date of May 14th, 1787 rolled around, 6 more names had been sent, or 6 more states had sent names. New Hampshire is going to delay until June, which means their delegates aren't going to get there until July, and Rhode Island just stays out of it. They don't want to have a part in this. Before it is all said and done, you're going to have 29 delegates from 9, so it starts with 29 delegates from 9 states, and they start work on May 25th. Before it is all said and done, there's going to be 73 men elected to work in the convention. 55 are going to attend, 39 are going to sign, and 3 are going to refuse. This convention had a relatively young, oh, we need to switch slides, sorry. Okay, so for y'all, if you're curious, I'm sitting because I hurt my foot, and I don't. Hang on. You know, technology is wonderful. Get to here. Actually, okay, I'm gonna leave. This is actually what we need. Next one. That. It either works half-assed or it doesn't work at all. All right. They were made up, the group was very varied. There were farmers, merchants, lawyers, bankers. They were men of intelligence. They were men of experience. 21 had served in the war. 7 had served as state governors. Most had been members of Congress at one point or another. 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence. So you have a group that has a lot of experience in the growing government. George Washington will preside over the meeting, but he really doesn't do much in the debates. He just keeps the peace. Benjamin Franklin, who's getting a little long in the tooth by this point, he's 81, provides experience, wit, and common sense. The big players are these gentlemen. James Madison is a political philosopher. Elbridge Geary, they call Old Grumbletonian. He pretty much doesn't agree with anything unless it's his idea. George Mason, Madison's a Virginian. George Mason is a Virginian. I label him the suspicious slave-holding planter. He helps protect Southern rights. Gouverneur Morris, and yes, his name is Governor, was a New York aristocrat. James Wilson was a very shrewd Scottish-born lawyer from Pennsylvania. And Roger Sherman is a consummate negotiator. These are kind of the roles that they are going to play. And pretty much everybody agrees on one thing. The government derives power from the people, but society must be protected from the tyranny of the majority. And they all come together, excuse me, my nose is itchy this morning, with the stated goal of revising the Articles of Confederation. So they get in there to the convention, they all get settled, and the first thing out of the box James Madison suggests, rather than revise the Articles of Confederation, let's just skip that step. Let's just scrap the Articles of Confederation. He puts forth what he calls the Virginia Plan, which calls for the delegates to write a new document and submit it to the states. It would include separate legislative, executive, and judicial functions. It would have a Congress made up of two houses, one chosen by popular vote, one chosen by the states. Congress would be able to disallow state laws and define the extent of its and the state's authorities. His plan would create a truly national government with laws that bind on individual citizens as well as the states. Because if you remember, the Articles of Confederation, the states hold most of the power. And you can have one law in one state that doesn't apply to another state. Madison's saying that's ridiculous. We need laws that apply to everybody. So, we have that idea. A second plan is also offered up. Go away, go away. Please go away. I can open up this one. The New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan would basically keep the Articles of Confederation in a sense. It would be a unicameral Congress like what they are working under, but it would give Congress the power to levy taxes and regulate commerce. So you wouldn't have a tariff in one state and a different tariff in another, and Congress would be able to raise revenue and therefore be able to do things. Congress could choose to name a plural executive with no veto, so basically a president by committee, and they could set up a Supreme Court. So the big question is going to become, why I cannot master PowerPoint. That's one of the big questions. Amend it or scrap it. And if you amend it or if you scrap it, do you choose representation by state or by population? Everyone there realized that state powers needed to be limited. These are some of the issues that have been causing major headaches. States at this point can issue money. They can make and break contracts. They can make treaties, which is really bizarre when you have a whole country. You shouldn't have one state in it making treaties. They can wage war and they can levy taxes. That's not a nation. That's 13 little nations. So these are issues that they want to tackle. And how best to tackle that? Do you take the New Jersey plan? Do you take the Virginia plan? What do you come up with? So in steps George Sherman. Sherman, well, he's not the only one, but he plays a big part in this. You compromise. You take a little bit from both plans. They decide that they are going to scrap the Articles of Confederation. So basically, they're going to get rid of the government and start over. It's kind of a bloodless coup in one sense. The big question becomes population. And this is where George Sherman steps in. The southern states have a high population, but a large number of their population are slaves. How do you count those? They're not voters. The smaller states obviously don't want to go with population because that limits their voting ability. Slavery is going to become the most volatile issue. You know, it wasn't lost on our founding fathers, the hypocrisy of fighting a revolutionary war and keeping slaves. But they can't seem to get past that. So Sherman proposes, because the South wants slaves counted for representation, the North wants slaves counted for taxation. Because if you're going to tax based on population, yeah, let the southern states pay more than we are. So they compromise and they decide that they will count each slave as 3/5 of a person. That works out. They also decide that the slave trade will end after 1808, and they place a $10 per head tax on imported slaves until it ends. Women, though they tried, get no role in this. Immigration is another issue that brings up some hard feelings. They decide that the president has to have been born, at least in the colonies, and in the future within the states. For a senator, you have to have been in the colonies or the states for 9 years. To serve in the House, it's 7. One of the reasons that they decided on a natural-born president was Alexander Hamilton. There were people who did not want him to be president. And he had been born in the Caribbean, not in the colonies. Therefore, that was one way to cut him out. Those were issues they negotiated on. I'm sure I'm just kind of glossing over them, but the slavery issue was a great source of consternation, trying to figure out exactly how to work that out. What they agreed on, or more easily worked out, was the format for the new government. These are, students of Locke. They are students of the Republican ideology. They believe in a separation of powers, and they put a lot of checks and balances in our Constitution. They create a legislature that is bicameral, so two houses. The House of Commons, that would be closer to like the House of Commons, is made up of people who are closer to their constituents. They are originally voted on by popular vote. They will serve for 2 years. Because it's a short term, the feeling was they would be more loyal to their constituents if they want to be reelected. Because if you're elected and you go to Congress and you start doing voting contrary to what your constituents want, they're not going to reelect you in 2 years. The Senate was to be more detached, to be less influenced by peer pressure, which is essentially what you are influenced by if you're trying to get revoted. You are taking into account what your peers want. The Senate, like I said, is supposed to be more detached. They're 6-year terms. They're staggered. So every 3 years, a half of the Senate will be reelected. So they're not as tied to their constituents, and they're chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote at this point. Obviously things are going to change. The executive. There was a lot of discussion over an executive. We still fear the king. But they decide that the executive would have veto power over Congress, which with enough votes, Congress could override. That's one of those checks and balance. The president would also be commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He would have the ability to make treaties, but they would have to be approved by the Senate. Another check. They could appoint diplomats, judges, and other officers, but with the consent of Senate. And every year they had to report annually on the state of the nation. The president could not create legislation, but he could recommend legislation. They could not declare war or make peace without, that is declaring war and declaring peace are powers of Congress. He could be removed from office. One of the big debates comes over how do you choose your president? Several people, Madison, Wilson, Hamilton, all wanted just a straight popular vote. Let the people choose. But it was eventually decided on an electoral college, which we still use today. There was a great fear of the masses by our founding fathers. They didn't trust everybody to act virtuously in politics, and probably for good reasons, because they probably didn't either. We'll roll back over here. We're going to run out of slideshow. Ooh. There was very little debate over a Supreme Court. Both plans had called for a Supreme Court. They did decide that Congress would decide the number of justices. That's even been in the news lately because they are contemplating expanding that again. But there's nothing in the Constitution that actually states what the Supreme Court is going to do. It's implied that it is going to be a review of congressional action, but it's not stated. And it's going to, in the first probably 20 years of our country, the judiciary branch is going to set its own mission. And it will be to review the constitutionality of congressional action. It also has power over the states and over the state courts. Other issues, like I said, we've built in checks and balances. They wrote in that bills of attainder were not permissible. A bill of attainder makes an action criminal by legislative act. You also could not create ex post facto laws. So if it was not on the books that you can't murder somebody, and Bristen murders somebody, we can't make a law at that point and say, and then try her under it. You can make the law at that point, but you can't put Bristen in jail for it because it wasn't a law when she did it. So you can have laws made after the fact. There are states' rights issues that come up, and the states do keep certain rights, but Congress has some wiggle room in deciding what rights the states have. Because they had such issues with the Articles of Confederation that you couldn't amend it without a unanimous vote, they decide that amendments are going to be 2/3 vote to propose an amendment and 3/4 to ratify, getting rid of that unanimous issue. And this is where I quit working on my PowerPoint. So I will finish it and I will post it, but I'm going to keep lecturing and y'all will just have to deal with it. I'm sorry. So they come up with this great new document, a whole new government, essentially. Now what? You have to get everybody else on board. So the fight for ratification starts. The final article of the Constitution provides that the Constitution would be ratified with 9 states. That's that 3/4 thing. A draft is submitted to the states on September 28th, 1787. So they actually worked pretty fast. They got this done in half a year. And the debates start. And people come into 2 camps. You have the Federalists, who are advocating for this new, strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists, who want to keep what they had. They don't want a strong federal government. They say that's what we fought against the king for. The Federalists had the advantage. They were better organized. They had a very strong, able leadership. And a lot of the Federalists had a hand in writing the Constitution, so they knew what it said. You know, it's easier to argue your point if you know what the document says and you're not trying to study it. They knew what they wanted it to say as well. And when you write something, sometimes it doesn't exactly say what you think you said, but they know what they think they said, and they know what it says. And they start out their argument by printing a collection of essays in the local newspapers. They're printed in the New York newspapers and picked up by others between 1878 and 1787, and 1788. Alexander Hamilton instigates what has become known as the Federalist Papers. You can buy them all bound up nicely in a neat little book now. There were 85 articles total, 50 by Hamilton, 5 by Madison, and 5 by John Jay. They defend the principle of a supreme national authority while seeking to reassure the doubters that there was little fear of tyranny. They spend several essays on that theme. In number 10, Madison argues that size would make it impossible for any single faction to form a majority that could dominate the government. He points out that there are so many conflicting needs and interests in the country that it would be impossible for one group to gain the upper hand in a majority. The Anti-Federalists highlight existing fears of tyranny, and they point out that there was no Bill of Rights included in the Constitution. Most state constitutions have a Bill of Rights. There's no guarantee with this new document that you're going to have a guarantee of freedom of speech or trial by jury. These aren't written in. The anti-Federalist leaders, so the Federalist leaders are Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, Jefferson. Bless you. The anti-Federalist leaders are George Mason, who was one of the people at working on the committee, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Samuel Adams, George Clinton, Elbridge Gerry. So you have big names on both sides. But the Federalists are a little more convincing. But the decision is left to the states. And momentum is gained before the end of 1787. Delaware becomes the first state to approve the Constitution and ratify it, followed by New Jersey and Georgia. They were all unanimous. Connecticut follows their number 4. Massachusetts, following a very close vote, 187 to 168, ratifies it in February of 1788. So they're 5th, followed by Maryland, South Carolina. I'm not counting right. New Hampshire's the 9th state. And with New Hampshire, it could be adopted. But everybody in power realizes you've got to have Virginia. Virginia is pretty much the most powerful colony, state, whatever you want to call it at this point. And Virginia is recommending a Bill of Rights. But as soon as New Hampshire ratifies, Congress begins planning the transfer of power. New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island all jump on board. Virginia ratifies it, but with the proviso that it needs a Bill of Rights. On September 13th, 1788, the Congress chooses New York City as the new capital and sets dates for the elections. And on October 10th, 1788, the Confederation Congress does its last day work. So we have an entirely new nation. At this point, the United States spans from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Population is around 4 million people. It is larger than any European republic. It has distinct regional differences. New England has the burgeoning manufacturing sector. They're the merchants. The middle Atlantic states, New York, Pennsylvania, that area is the most well-balanced economically, has the largest cities, and is the most diverse. The South is agricultural, more homogeneous, and very dependent on slave labor. So in 1790, the South is exporting as much tobacco as before the Revolution, and cotton is surging. Cotton is going to go from 3 million pounds in 1790 to 93 million pounds in 1815. Overall, all of the states included, it's a rural society with 80% of the households agricultural. There are few cities with over a population of 5,000. Only about 125,000 people live west of the Appalachian Mountains. Kentucky has 75,000 people in 1790, but it's going to reach statehood by 1792. But the area is rapidly filling up. Cheap land, new opportunities. The average woman at this time is having 8 children, doubling the population every 22 years. And it is a very young population. In 1790, almost half of all Americans are under 16. This is what the new government was going to run. This is the new nation. On March 4th, 1789, the new Congress meets with only 8 senators and 13 representatives. Kind of a slow start. It took a month before a quorum could be gathered. George Washington is certified the president. He's sort of a unanimous choice. John Adams is chosen as his vice president. And Washington is apprehensive, pleads that there will be national unity and no politics, which maybe lasts through his term, but not really, because even he was political. So now we have a brand new government running this relatively young nation. And everybody's trying to figure out just exactly what their role is. If you read the Constitution, it's not real specific about who does. I mean, it's specific to a point about who does what, but it doesn't, give you total guidelines. So Washington looks at his job as executive and decides he needs some help in the executive office. So he names Thomas Jefferson to head a new department called the Department of State. Alexander Hamilton, who had been one of his trusted aides during the Revolution, is picked as the head of the Department of the Treasury. Edmund Randolph is chosen as an attorney general. Now you got to remember there are equivalent positions in foreign governments, but these don't exist in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we have an attorney general. Washington decides we need these. And he creates what is going to become the cabinet. Every president since Washington has had a cabinet. And the cabinet is supposed to advise the president on different aspects of government. John Adams, as vice president, is really kind of out in left field. There's really nothing in the Constitution for the vice president, except some duties within the Senate as a tiebreaker. In fact, Adams said that the vice president position was the most insignificant office ever contrived. The court system, Congress sets membership of the Supreme Court at 6, a Chief Justice and 5 associates. They set up 13 federal district courts, which makes sense. There's 13 new states. There will be more added. There's 3 circuit courts. And in these circuit courts, 2 Supreme Justices and a district court will meet twice yearly at each of these places. John Jay is chosen as the first Chief Justice, and he will be Chief Justice until 1795. And Congress gets started on that Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was requested by Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and North Carolina, and they put enough pressure to get it done. James Madison presents the constitutional amendments. They're approved, so 2/3 vote to approve them in 1789, September, and they're sent to the states. Most states will ratify it by the end of 91. You know what, I'm assuming you know what the Bill of Rights are. You actually only get 10 to begin with. We're way beyond 10 now. So freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to bear arms, refusal to house soldiers, freedom from fear of unreasonable search and seizure, freedom not to testify against oneself, guarantee of a speedy public trial, and a prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They become effective, and the 9th and 10th, and we'll go back and talk about them, the 9th and 10th deal with personal and states' rights and what the federal government can and cannot do beyond those initial basic Bill of Rights. They become effective on December 15th, 1791. Religious freedom. Created a lot of debate. We are virtually the only nation that does not have a state-supported religion. And at the time of ratification, 2 states, New York and Virginia, still had state-supported religions. Most had given it up, but they didn't. But at this point, now they have, because Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This doesn't mean that it's not a Christian nation. It means taxes are not going to support any particular religion. It means that any citizen can practice whatever religion they so choose without being coerced by the government. That's the separation of church and state. On the issue of revenues, another area that's going to bring up high debate. You know what? Let's stop right here because I feel guilty that y'all don't have notes to go off of. We'll stop here with the raising revenues because I really don't want to get into Hamilton's economic plan without some sort of notes. So we'll stop here. I will make a PowerPoint to backfill and to fill out the rest of this section, and that will be good. Let me make a note right there. Start notes. y'all have a good week, and I'll see you again on Friday.